Well, good afternoon, everyone. It is so great to have you with us this afternoon. My name is Dan Worry, and I am not only of the Hunt Institute, but today I am at the Hunt Institute, which is something special to be able to say. After 14 months, we are starting to do a little bit of transition back into the real world on a limited basis. And so it's great to be here and to see colleagues, but also to be with you today. We are, if you are unfamiliar with the Institute, founded by the four-term governor of North Carolina, Jim Hunt, and we are a policy resource in education from prenatal on up through post-secondary to governors and state lawmakers and other senior state elected leaders across the country. This is our early efforts web series, and today we're going to be talking about creating equitable pathways for advancement within the early childhood workforce. The workforce has been the subject of a lot of attention in some good ways during the pandemic. One of the maybe silver linings of this past year from a professional perspective is that the workforce has been lifted up, I think, like maybe never before. They've been put into the first responder category and sort of held up in the same light as emergency medical personnel and others who have been supporting during the pandemic. And so definitely more attention, not only to the workforce, but also the value of the early childhood workforce. There's nothing that speaks to the value of something like having it suddenly not available. And so in many states, we had childcare closed down for a number of months or operating on very limited capacity. So maybe if we can have a hope and a dream coming out of this terrible public health crisis, it is that maybe there will be more attention paid to the needs of the early childhood workforce. They are certainly deserving, and we have an amazing panel with us today to sort of talk through the state of the early childhood workforce and what we can do to advance them equitably as they are moving up the career ladder. I am joined today by Dr. Calvin Moore, who is the Chief Executive Officer at the Council for Professional Recognition, which you all may know is responsible for the CDA program, which we'll talk about in just a moment. Leonard Dumas is the Executive Director of the National Association for Family Childcare. Leonard, it's great to have you with us. Lauren Hogan is the Managing Director of Policy and Professional Advancement at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, which, if you are not familiar, we will probably revert to calling NACI throughout this conversation. And Karen Ponder is a distinguished fellow at the BUILD initiative and has been an early childhood champion for this country for many, many years. Karen is also the chair of the recent Power to the Profession Task Force, and so has the recent experience of really thinking through the needs of the early childhood workforce. It's great to have all of you with us. Dr. Moore, I thought maybe we'd start with you and give you an opportunity to share, because the CDA credential is so critical to the early childhood workforce. Share with us a little bit about the Council for Professional Recognition, but also what is the Child Development Associate's credential? Who earns it? How is it earned? And how does it help to promote the advancement of professionals within the early childhood workforce?
Well, that's a mouthful, Dan, but the mission of the council is the improved performance and recognition of early childhood professionals working with young children ages birth to age 5. And of course, the CDA is our flagship credential. The CDA itself has been around for over 45 years, and NACI is a part of our history. But the council has been around 35 years administering the CDA program.
Is Dr. Moore frozen for the rest of you as well? Okay, why don't we give him just a second and let's see if that resolves, and if not, maybe we can come back to him. All right, well, maybe we will move on in that conversation and circle back to Dr. Moore when he has that sorted out. Lana, let's talk about family childcare. I think you and I had a chance to talk a little bit last week. That one of the I talked about the silver lining of maybe a little bit more recognition of the early childhood workforce. To me, one of the other great silver linings of the pandemic has been the attention and the maybe reinvigoration of family childcare in the country. I think we've seen statistics from around the nation that would imply, at least, that family childcare has been in a bit of a decline in recent years in terms of its numbers within state licensing systems. But a lot of discussion during this time, especially as families have been reluctant to enter into kind of larger group-based care during the pandemic, about what an ideal situation family childcare provides, generally in much sort of tighter, smaller clusters, and in a sort of a pod, if you will, from pandemic speak. So talk to us a little bit about where family childcare is from your perspective, and what role it has played during the pandemic.
Sure. Thank you, Dan, for having me here. It's such a pleasure. Yes, you are correct. Many families do prefer the smaller size, especially right now, the smaller size and flexibility of family childcare settings. And like you mentioned earlier, the COVID crisis put a spotlight on us, spotlight on what we've known for decades, that family childcare is the workforce behind the workforce. And these small businesses have an impact on local economies and are an important part of the early care and education delivery system. So throughout this crisis, we've done several surveys of family childcare professionals, and what we've seen is that they 2-in-1 programs remained open despite lowered enrollment, increased costs for operating, regulatory uncertainty. These programs remained open and available to families and communities. And so another thing that we've heard through our surveys and listening sessions is that this workforce is hurting after being so overlooked. So what we do is we offer tailored opportunities, professional development opportunities that are specifically geared to family childcare settings, and making sure that we offer opportunities during typically non-caregiving times. So not in the middle of the day, because we recognize that this sector of the early care and education workforce are often and I think we'll talk about this later, are often wearing many hats, and therefore can't pull away during the caregiving day. So we make sure that have opportunities available when they are available, and that there's lots of peer-to-peer support that happens. And just like the CDA as the flagship for the Council for Professional Recognition, our accreditation, our quality standards and recognition program, is our flagship, and it's specifically designed to measure the unique delivery of quality care and education that happens in family childcare. And we take care to honor the many right ways that best practices can be met while in a home-based setting. We've also seen throughout this pandemic that where there are trusted voices and strong connections, family childcare does better. So we strive for that in the field. And so we listen to our constituents as experts with education and lived experience to participate in regulation and quality journey for the setting. And we try to reflect that in our advocacy. And we're very hopeful that this historic investment of ARPA dollars will be delivered with equity, accuracy, and speed to give a lifeline to this essential workforce, because we need them, right?
You mentioned some of the unique things about family childcare. I'm curious, with the professional development that you've been able to provide over the past year, are there particular needs that family childcare providers have been speaking to you about over the past year that maybe they're the same, but maybe they're different from what center-based providers are seeking right now?
Right. So because of the uniqueness of the setting, usually these are sole proprietors, and so they have a unique set of skills. There's a variety of skills that they need that aren't necessarily those of their counterparts in center-based. So business training in business has been something that's been lifted up time and time again, because what we've noticed when a lot of the relief dollars came out during the pandemic, folks weren't necessarily, well, there were two sides of it. Folks weren't necessarily ready to say, okay, I lost this much in revenue, and so this is how much I need. So they didn't necessarily have the budgets and the mechanisms to show what they needed, but also the banks and the lending institutions weren't necessarily versed in that form of the small business, and were asking for things that were not necessarily relevant to the setting. So if you ask someone for a sole proprietor for their payroll report, then what do you do with that? So we've had lots and lots of requests from our constituents, and then from external agencies that care about the field, for business training for these women.
That's great. Dr. Moore, we lost you early on in the process, but want to circle back to you and let you say a little bit more about maybe pick up from what is the CDA, and how does it work, and how does it advance the field? And you're muted, Dr. Moore. Dr. Moore, you're muted.
Thanks, Dan. I'm having all kinds of issues over here. We have a thunderstorm and a tornado warning rolling through my area, so I apologize to the participants and to you. I was really saying that the CDA is the best first step for many early childhood professionals, and we believe strongly that is the best positioning for the credential. I would also say that we use time-tested research-based tools to award the credential. And to date, we believe we've awarded 800,000 credentials since the beginning of the CDA history. And we awarded about 40,000 last year in the midst of the pandemic. So while we were impacted, we believe that many folks renewed their CDA last year, and we're really interested in why that happened. And as we surveyed individuals who were coming back to the council, we realized that people needed options in the midst of the pandemic. So folks who had left the field were coming back, people who had maybe not had time to renew their CDA in previous years, took the time during the pandemic to renew the credential. So the CDA is still alive and well in our field. What I would say that a CDA recipient receives is that by receiving this credential, we verify that teachers have embraced the council's nationally recognized competency standards and can perform those and understand why those standards are important for children and families. As they learn more about teaching, they understand the knowledge base that every early childhood professional needs to do wonderful work with children. And so that's what we do in the teacher preparation space. We provide the foundational support that a good teacher needs to move through the career lattice, whether they choose to move into an associate's degree program or a bachelor's degree. The CDA really is the focal point and the beginning of their journey.
Dr. Moore, thank you. And I want to remind those of you who are viewing today, if you have questions for the panel, we will take some time a little bit later in the hour to address some questions from you. So I invite you to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen to enter your questions there, and we'll try to get to a few of those in just a bit. Karen, I want to turn to you at this point. You have had, as I referenced earlier, a chance to play so many leadership roles in the field over a period of years. You've been a teacher and a director and an early childhood policymaker. You have a very special connection in our case to Governor Hunt as part of the startup and the early implementation of the Smart Start program here in North Carolina. But you also have done a lot of work here here in the relatively recent past on the needs of the early childhood workforce as the chair of the Power to the Profession Task Force, which brought together, I believe it was 15 organizations to really create a framework for moving the profession forward. Tell us a little bit about what was the impetus to sort of begin the Power to the Profession Task Force, and what does the final framework tell us about the needs of the workforce in your estimation? And Karen, you're muted as well. Yep.
Okay. Calvin, I'm glad I'm not the only one. We're having a storm too, but it's just started, so I don't know what it's going to do. So Power to the Profession is a national collaboration that defines the early childhood education profession. It established a unifying framework of recommendations that relate to educator roles and responsibilities, aligned preparation and pathways, compensation, infrastructure, and shared accountability. The impetus for this was simply because one did not exist. I had called myself an early childhood educator my entire career, which has been a long career. And yet I knew that I was kind of making that up because there wasn't one, but I felt like I was as close to it as you could get being a teacher and such. And so when I had this opportunity to be a part of this, I knew from personal experience that it was something that will change our world for young children if we can get it in place. So national organizations, as well as states and communities, have worked hard over the years on all of the issues related to building a workforce and professional development opportunities for all parts of the formal childhood teaching workforce. But there has been no formal agreement about how the profession is defined and supported and is held accountable. And in fact, in many states, there was no relationship between what we were requiring teachers to know and be able to do and the compensation our teachers were receiving. A report was released by the Institute of Medicine and the National Research Council in 2015 that called for a unified approach. In 2017, a national task force was created to guide the development of this framework and create it for an early childhood profession. And in March 2020, Power to the Profession, the result of that 3-year process, was released just before COVID shut our worlds down. So 15 national organizations, including 3 that you see on your screen today, were part of that process, but it also included each of the organizations on the council represented hundreds of thousands of early childhood workforce. But the process also included a diverse group of early childhood teachers in many varied settings. And when we would send our beginning thinking out to this group of early childhood educators, they would straighten us out in a hurry, and we would go back and change what we had offered. It was a very fluid process, and that's frankly why it took 3 years to do it. So a variety of states are now considering the adoption of this framework, and I believe it's the best opportunity that exists for building a profession of early childhood educator that will be managed by the educators themselves, much like the nursing and most other professions. And this unified approach will provide a framework and accountability system then that all our supports, such as higher education and compensation, can be based on. While NAEYC hosted the work of Power to the Profession, and the director, Rian Alvin, served as an equal member on the task force, NAEYC did not own this process. It was a process that was equally shared by the members of the group. So if you want to learn more details about this or download the framework and the recommendations, you can go to naeyc.org.
Terrific, Karen. And with that, Lauren, it's a natural segue to you and the work of NAEYC. As Karen mentioned, you know, the organization serves sort of as the host of this process, but you know, one of many equal partners in developing the framework. But NAEYC is really a leading voice, if not certainly the leading voice for early childhood professionals across the country, and advocates across a wide range of different provider types and so on. So you have kind of a unique perspective there. Talk maybe in a little bit more detail about what the framework actually lays out in practice, and what it would mean in these states that are considering piloting it, and how that will help in the process of equitably advancing the workforce.
Yeah, thanks, Dan, and hi everybody. So I would say a couple of things. The way that Karen really laid it out around, the educators really created the framework. It's very much by them, with them, for them. It was called Power to the Profession for a reason. It really is about centering the voices and experiences and expertise of the educators. And I think one of the critical things about the framework, and even more so probably in the context of the pandemic and some of the opportunities ahead, at the federal level, state level, we've all heard a lot of the excitement and opportunities that lie ahead for early childhood education, is that it is about this whole system and understanding that you can be a prepared, compensated, supported early childhood educator. And not only can be, but we actually must be in a mixed delivery system, right? Working with children of all ages from birth through age 8 in family childcare homes and centers and schools. That care and education isn't set right. It happens in all of these places. It isn't care on one hand and education on the other. I think, for me, sort of honing in on 3 elements of the implementation of the framework that sort of are explicitly about advancing equity as we come back from the pandemic. Like Karen talked about, we launched the framework on March 10th, was the last time a lot of us were probably together in a room full of people we were not related to. And so first, I think it's about compensation, period. And I think if we are not talking about compensation, and I mean both wages and benefits, I know we talk a lot about wages and we'll talk more about this later. If we're not talking about compensation, then we are not talking about equity. This is a workforce primarily women of color, who earn so little that nearly half have to access public benefits to make ends meet. And again, we'll talk a little more about the how, what relief offers us right now, but the framework is always about driving compensation by sort of getting to this question of some of which were previously unanswered around compensation for who and for doing what. That's sort of how we define how we move this forward. And we'll talk about, I know, sort of how to get to compensation, because there are lots of opportunities now. Second, I think, and related, it's about redirecting funding and focus to be on the workforce itself. And this is really important for states thinking about how we're implementing this work moving forward. It's not on all of the, we're really good at all of the things around the workforce. We have for years invested in all of the things around the workforce, but not the workforce itself. This was always part of Power to the Profession. It's never intended for the recommendations to layer on top of the existing systems, but to really reorient and realign and frankly unwind and undo some of the existing systems that we've had, so that we're freeing up that funding and focus to direct it on the thing that we know makes the biggest difference in driving access and quality and supply, which is the workforce. So we have this impetus now around the federal relief, thinking about how these dollars get spent, where our priorities are they equitably accessible? So really honing in on this focus and this way of spending. Finally, I'll just say, I think part of it is that as we implement this, it's about how we all have a role to play, right? This is about owning our own accountability. This is coming for us all, okay? Congress is not going to hand out hundreds of billions of dollars in public investment in early childhood education, which is what we're all asking for and what we need, and not have expectations about what happens with those dollars. If we do not define our field for ourselves, someone else will. So this is not theoretical, right? Like, we have to say we welcome the accountability as long as we have the resources to meet it. In the past, I think we've said, look, we're raising qualifications like best of luck to you, friends. And we can't say that anymore. This is about the role that we all have to play at the institutes of higher education. We can't ask educators to take credits that build to nothing, that aren't articulated and transferred. How do states, what are the roles that employers and states and the federal government have to play? And the framework speaks to all of those pieces so that it isn't on the backs of educators. And the task force really, you know, Karen talked about these, made some really important commitments to the field, you know, around not advocating for increased educational requirements without advocating for the compensation and supports, thinking about timelines, thinking about recognizing the particular challenges like Lana and Calvin have talked about in terms of family childcare and other community-based providers. So, you know, I'll turn it back over to you guys to talk a little bit more about family childcare in this context and really thinking about our whole system.
So Lana, let's do that. Let's talk a little bit about sort of the professional advancement of the family childcare workforce. You know, one of the things that we know about the early childhood workforce generally is that it can be very difficult for them to continue their education. They are, you know, they're working in full-time roles, which limits in some cases, you know, opportunities to access higher education, for example, to, you know, programs that are available after hours. And in some cases, there are, you know, geographic disparities where it's, you know, not easily accessed no matter what time of day. And then in, you know, in family childcare, there is a, you know, as you already alluded to, sort of a unique dynamic that's very different from center-based programs, in that these are often kind of sole proprietorships, that they are, you know, involved in every aspect of running that that business, which, you know, I would imagine creates, you know, even more obstacles potentially to the ability of some family childcare providers to access, you know, some of that ongoing training and higher education. How are you envisioning sort of a system for the advancement of the family childcare workforce?
So I think I want to start by saying, reiterating, because I have to say this so much, it's a mantra, family childcare is early care and education delivered in a residential setting. That's a thing that I've had lots of light bulbs go off when we're like stressing the fact that learning happens. It's just a residential setting. And yes, often the educator is the lone educator wearing all the hats that we talked about earlier to provide these quality experiences that do lead to school readiness and lifelong success, and requires a variety of skills, as I mentioned earlier, that aren't expected of educators in other settings. And so I think to adequately address the question of and advancing the career pathways for this sector, we have to start with the belief and policies that family childcare belongs in the career pathways. And that's something we're still fighting. We're thankful for Power to the Profession for actually lifting up all settings and saying that there's parity if you're doing the same things, that there's parity there. But we also have to acknowledge something that Debbie Moore used to say nearly 2 decades ago. Most family childcare providers are not going to bed at night dreaming of the day that they become a childcare center or preschool teacher. And this is their chosen profession, and they do provide good opportunities for families and young children in their homes. This is their career. So the way that I envision moving the pathways for family childcare is making sure that it's meaningful, it's relevant, it leads to something, and that the compensation, as Lauren mentioned, the compensation is equitable and benefits are delivered, and that we're making this a viable field to enter into and to stay in. I've said this quite often recently, that there's not a shortage of teachers, but there's a shortage of master's level professionals that are willing to work for $35,000 a year. So as long as we're not providing professional supports that are actually relevant to the family child care setting, and not compensating appropriately, then we're going to be missing a valuable part of our workforce. I think there's another piece that you wanted.
I think we may have both forgotten at this point, so it's okay. Dr. Moore, let's turn back to you. There was a really fascinating report not long ago from the National Head Start Association, the Head Starter Network, and Bellwether Education, called Broader, Deeper, and Fairer: 5 Strategies for a Radically Expanded Talent Pool in Early Education. And one of the things that it called for is kind of an expanded credential that would expand on the skills and the expertise of the initial CDA and eventually be comparable to a 4-year degree. Is this something, as you're kind of looking forward into the future of the council, that you see advancing?
So I happen to be part of the catalyst conversation that led to this white paper that was produced, and the Broader, Deeper, Fair conversation was really provocative, and I think the white paper is also meant to be provocative. I'm a disruptor naturally, so I actually liked the paper and really thought deeply about what it might mean for the council. The repository, the National Repository of Education Organizations that are delivering CDA content, was actually an interesting idea that we could easily embrace at the council, because we do have a similar mechanism with our gold standard initiative, where we try to allow people to know the kinds of high quality training apparatus that exists in the country. However, the CDP, which is the Child Development Professional that was mentioned in the paper, is a little bit more difficult for me to wrap my head around. That being said, I am interested in the conversation and think it's one that we probably need to have in our field. But I certainly want to be respectful of those higher ed institutions, the associate's degree and the bachelor's degree that already exist. I fully support that apparatus and think that anything that we do in the credential sphere needs to be respectful of the apparatus that already exists. However, I do believe that there is a wide gulf between the child development associate and those other degrees, and maybe this CDP is meant to fill that void. That being said, Dan, I do want to be wide-eyed in my approach to this conversation, because I know that many Black and brown women across the country do not have access to higher ed degrees. They don't have access to those institutions. They don't have access to the finances that it would require a person to have access to acquire a degree these days. So not only do we have to figure out how to pay a livable wage and a respectful wage, but we also have to give people access to those credentials. Because if we don't, then we're not diversifying our field, and we don't have a diverse pool of candidates to employ. That being said, maybe the CDP is the answer to that access question, because I do believe it's not just about the competencies that a teacher needs and the credential being equal to a bachelor's degree. It's all about, if I don't have an access to this degree through the traditional lane, maybe the CDP is meant to have another pathway to a very similar credential for those women who can't access the higher ed institutions.
That's great. Karen and Lauren, I want to maybe turn to both of you with this next question. I think Lauren has laid out just how big an issue compensation is for the field, but we also recognize that we're in a pretty unique moment right now for early childhood, with the American Rescue Plan allocating billions and billions of dollars to states to help to advance and stabilize the needs of childcare. One of the conversations, though, that we have been having with state early childhood leaders, is around the fact that I think I would characterize that the states are very interested in the idea of doing something around compensation, but also very reluctant in the sense that this American Rescue Plan money is ultimately one-time funding. It's something that they'll have the ability to spend over a couple of years. But ultimately is not something that they may be able, at least, to sustain. And anytime that you're talking about compensation reforms in particular, that's a kind of a tricky issue with one-time funding. So states have looked at stipends and bonus pay and other sort of on the edges of the compensation conversation. So Karen, maybe curious to begin with your perspective working with the Build Initiative. What are you seeing states doing at this point around compensation, and what might you recommend to them?
So Dan, thank you. You're right. With the stimulus funding and the talk of the additional funding for early childhood, many state government, nonprofit, and community leaders are talking a lot about professional development, about degrees and credentials and compensation. And I'll just give you a few specific examples. So in New Jersey, they've recently released an opinion piece that's aimed at sounding the alarm about New Jersey's child care staffing crisis, as they're calling it. And it underscores that the real costs of staffing crises are inadequate wages. And this report makes a case for the importance of using the stimulus package to actually address that crisis. Vermont has expanded its early childhood apprenticeship program, which they have had in place for a lot of years, to support more early childhood educators who are seeking both an educational and a supervised experience in the field before they walk into a classroom, much like CDA does, Calvin, in a different sense. And then Minnesota released a new report, which is called Transforming Financing of Early Childhood Education, with three main recommendations. One, support the establishment of an early childhood profession, adopting the framework of power to the profession. Number two, provide equitable compensation. And three, invest in institutes of higher education that are supporting the field. State legislatures are also working night and day on these issues and are writing bills, like I was reading recently, hundreds and hundreds of them, to address specific issues in various parts of the system. So one example is Massachusetts is requiring the Department of Early Education and Care to establish an individual retirement account for care providers, including, Lynette, I'm sure you had something to do with this, family child care. And there are many, many other examples. But here's what I'm worried about. And I have to sort of lay this out today. Just a word of caution. I'm really worried that even though $50 billion is being made available, that we will piecemeal things together as we've been really, really good at in the past, and I'm including my own work here. And that we won't see this money as an opportunity to build a strong system that addresses the real problem in our field. We try to get at it a bunch of different ways, but the real problem is you can't make a living teaching young children. And that's a serious problem for now and for the future. So we've made our best attempts at addressing the issues, and given where we were in a particular time, it all made sense as we were doing it. If you all will sort of believe that, looking back for a long ways. We've often tried short-term, cheaper strategies because we knew that fixing the problem would be expensive. And frankly, we were afraid to say how much it would actually cost when we were trying to get our work really off the ground, because the price tag was phenomenal. And then we were still trying to get people to believe the brain research, that it mattered what happened in the earliest years. But regardless of how many scholarships we give or how many QRIS standards we create, or how many workshops we provide that don't actually articulate to a degree. I'm right with you, Calvin, on that. Then we're still not solving the real problem, and we're never going to achieve the best results for all children, especially for those that are farthest from opportunities. And so I hope that leaders in states and communities will think this issue through very carefully while we're just on the edge of making decisions about this. Somebody told me recently that, like Dan said, that their state was not going to do anything about permanent compensation. Are you kidding me? Because they were afraid to invest money that might run out. And I just want to say that I believe that if we don't do something about what most of us know is the real problem, we'll spend this money on good things. I'm not doubting that. And then we'll see no structural or long-term results. And I believe that that gives us no hope of getting future money to fix the problem. I just think it's a crisis that we have an opportunity to address. And if we don't do it now, we're going to look back and say, why, when we had the chance, didn't we do it? Because then you use that, your results, to get the money for the future. Sorry about the preaching.
Amen. Lauren, weigh in on Nancy's behalf. Are there states that you see right now leading in the compensation conversation amidst this new federal money?
Yeah, I mean, same to all of, I mean, Karen just gave a masterclass in everything that states need to be thinking about, everything that advocates need to be thinking about. I mean, we could solve around all of the challenges. And if we don't solve the thing that matters the most, then we will still have all these challenges with us. Karen mentioned the staffing issue. I will say this is what we are hearing the most about. And we are incredibly grateful to many members of the field and to all of our partners who have been so generous with their time and their expertise and sharing their experiences for all the surveys. And the staffing challenges, you know, you talked about how educators have been lifted up at the beginning, and I can tell you they also feel really beaten down. And we see that in the staffing challenges. Folks aren't leaving for where they can, they're leaving for where they can get compensation and benefits, whether that's leaving center-based community programs for the public schools or going to Costco. I mean, people are finding their way out to where they can make a living. And, you know, Karen talked about the opportunity that we have ahead of us, not just in relief funding. Relief funding can provide this pathway to build towards a system. And Karen mentioned everybody from, you know, is thinking about this from Vermont to New Mexico to Minnesota to Arkansas and Alabama, to thinking about how we look at different pieces of the system. We're not going to get to, on $50 billion, we're not going to get to compensation for everybody within the field tomorrow. But there is a pathway to address some of the structural changes that need to take place so that we're addressing, benefits, bonuses that put funds into educators that need them now, but also look at how to actually build towards systems of contracts and grants where you can actually build in a way to hold employers accountable. If we pay you the cost of care, if we pay you what it costs, if we pay you for the cost of quality, and that includes compensation for educators, how do you then translate that? How are we holding you accountable for making sure that you're building that into your contract or grant? How do we think too about benefits, making sure that educators have access? I know in Washington State, they're just building in subsidies for educators purchasing health insurance within the marketplace. Can we help make sure that educators have access to health insurance, to substitute pools so that they can take advantage of all of the higher education, so that they can take advantage of paid leave? And how do we think about that in the context of family childcare, where it is more of it's almost like respite for thinking about for family childcare so that they have the support they need, so that they can also continue to pursue. And there is equitable access to all of these benefits. There are ways to make sure that educators across settings are able to have access to these benefit situations. And that is driving, obviously we focus on wages a lot because the wages are so low, but it is part of the whole package to think about the benefits that they get as well. That is part of building a profession, is about having professional salaries and compensation that go along with that, and giving folks the ability to scale up to having that kind of work. We know that folks are increasing payment rates and reimbursement rates for providers. We know that does not necessarily translate to increased compensation directly. You can increase wages, but if you're going from the 11th percentile of 2014 wages to the 30th percentile of 2017, and there are 2 kids on subsidy in your program, you've got a long way to go. But thinking about how you start to use the reimbursement rates to really build scale, expanding eligibility, and then building scale so that you can increase the wages of the providers in your program. Make sure more providers actually want to be part of the subsidy system because the incentives aren't so upside down.
That's great. We are going to go to here for the last few minutes that we have together some of the questions in the chat. And I will say, looking through them, there are some really intriguing ones in here. And I'm going to throw these out to the panel generally. But Karen, this one I feel like maybe is a good one to throw, at least initially, to you. Ryan is asking, how can we focus on fixing this compensation problem without relying on public funding or forced wage increases? And so I guess my related question to you is that possible? We know that providers, for the most part, are not operating on terrifically large profit margins. We know that the workforce literally cannot be paid less in a legal sense. And we know that parents are paying as much, in many states, more than the price of college tuition to attend childcare. Is there a solution to this compensation question that doesn't rely on public funding?
I would say no, there's not, because of all the things you've said. Now, I do think all of the sectors have to play their role in it and contribute their part to it. But I don't think there's any way, just like how would we think of public education for all children without the public through their taxes paying toward it? So I just think it's for me, it's the wrong question to ask. And I really thought about this long and hard when we were doing our work here. Was there any possible way? Because at that point, you wouldn't have even talked about getting public money to the extent that we need it to make a solid system. But somebody else may have a different opinion, but that's just my sort of based on my work. I don't think we can. And I think we need to not apologize for asking for something that is the foundation for all education from the time a child's born till they go to work. It's the early education that forms the foundation, and it is in the public good. And so I think the public has to pay its share.
Let me throw that out to the rest of the panel. Anybody want to weigh in?
I certainly agree with Karen. Of course, she doesn't need poor old me to agree with her,
Yes.
But she's articulated it well. Until we view it as a public good and that we establish that it needs to be universal. I mean, for many years, Dan, I was the one saying Head Start for everybody, regardless of your economic status. The program needs to be extended and fully funded so that every 4-year-old in the country has an opportunity to a high quality experience. And people laughed at me. But until we make it universal and until we make an established attempt to give a high quality experience to everyone, I don't think people would view it as a public good, because it cannot be a program solely for poor people. It's got to be a program imagined for every single child in the country as a public investment in their future. And once it's viewed that way, then people will invest in it and they'll understand that it is something that we should aspire to.
And I want to make sure that we are being very clear that family child care is a viable setting for the delivery of this. And I know that Dr. Moore is one of the first champions one of the first champions of family child care, being a part of the early Head Start delivery system, but extending that to universal pre-K and a part of the public good, that learning happens, school readiness happens, all of those things happen in this home-based setting, and it honestly addresses facilities issues. I know Dr. Moore lifted that up in the early days, facilities issues and access, flexible hours, home culture, home language, continuity of all those things are just an integral part of the delivery of family child care education. And so it can't be left out. And the compensation has to be what it is for quality care. It's not cheaper because it's in someone's home. It costs the same or more. The overhead is still there because the home has to be paid for. And so I know when in my earlier work in CCR&Rs, we knew in the state that I'm from that childcare centers didn't reach break even until they had enrollment of 54. And family childcare is 6 to 18, depending on where you are. So we know that they're nowhere near that break even point if we look at the numbers in that way. So I think we really do need to concentrate on what the true cost of quality care is, and maybe think about a different model for how we compensate all programs across the board.
Really important because, we are subsidizing the system right now. It's just that the educators are subsidizing it. It's their low wages.
Say that again, Lauren. That's worth repeating. The the providers are subsidizing the quality.
Yeah. I mean, that's not how we tend to think about it, but it is what's happening. And Karen talked about there are multiple payers into the system. The educators are one of those payers because of their low wages, but that is unsustainable in terms of giving parents choices. This is about choice for families, making sure that they can choose between quality and quality. Right now, that is not how parents are able to choose. They're choosing on convenience and affordability because that's all the choices that are given to them. This is about making sure that the system has enough investment in it so that parents can choose what works for them between quality and quality, given what we know about the science. I know we are in a pandemic moment where early childhood education is mostly about workforce development. It's about helping get our economy back on its feet. It's about driving women in the workforce. All of this is all. For years, we have struggled between the pendulum between workforce development support and child development. It's both. Can we say it is both a workforce support and a child development support, just like K-12? Turns out it's the biggest childcare system in our country. We just don't talk about it that way either. And so seeing these pieces together as care and education, as a workforce support and a child development support, we got to resolve some of this and be able to see it as part of us so that we get that public good investment that really drives what we know we need to do in early childhood education once and for all.
Lauren, I feel like we would be remiss. We've only got a couple of minutes left, but President Biden announced plans for the American Families Plan here over the past several days that would include the large-scale, implementation of pre-K for 3 and 4-year-olds that would, implement, some sort of limitation on cost for families seeking childcare. How do you see the American Families Plan proposal sort of fitting into this whole conversation around compensation and advancement of the workforce in particular?
Yeah, I mean, I'll go quickly, and I know we have other questions to get to too. Just the American Families Plan and the American Jobs Plan together, really thinking about investment, recognition of childcare and early childhood education as the infrastructure that allows America to work. And I don't mean just work in terms of go to work, I mean literally function. Being able to see both of these pieces as universal preschool and childcare as part of a system for children birth to 5 that really fit together, that we're able to think about what families need, and that we're able to think too, there's a lot that fits into the plans around infrastructure and facilities around investment in community college. Calvin talked about making sure that folks have access to higher ed. There's so many pieces in there that really fit into an overall look at making sure that we're able to drive a well-compensated, well-prepared, well-supported, diverse and equitable profession across states and settings to really be able to hold this together, and that really looks at building on relief and recognizing how that has started the process of transformation, that these kinds of high-level investments that we're seeing both from the administration and from Congress, that this is really a window to move this forward and to really take advantage of the moment that we have before us.
Leonard, I know we had talked earlier this week about, we spoke, I think right after the American Families Plan was announced. What's your thinking at this point about the role of family child care? I know we don't have all of the details in terms of how all of this would be implemented at this point, but what role do you see family child care playing in an expansion of public pre-K, for example?
Yeah, just like we said earlier in the week, I do think, and this is such a hot button topic right now, but I know that this universal pre-K has to be offered through mixed delivery. That's the only way to actually make it equitable and accessible for families, usable for families, and beneficial for children. And so family child care is a setting that this works in and can work in, and with the proper investments and supports, family child care educators can be a valuable part of the delivery of universal pre-K. We're seeing it in Indiana very intentionally. They've included family child care. We have good examples in Oregon. And again, I think if we talk about the model of how family child care is used in early Head Start partnerships, we can replicate that and replicate the good things, the core values behind that, and see how we're able to make sure that we don't leave this large part of our early care and education delivery system out as we move forward. We don't want to decimate childcare, and especially family child care, with the idea of universal pre-K, because it's not just school buildings, it's not buildings, it's relationships, learning, and education, regardless of the building.
We're getting very tight on time, but Deborah makes an interesting comment on the in the chat, and Karen wanted to throw this out sort of through the lens of the Power to the Profession Task Force. She's saying there's a real concern about how public money could end up forcing stricter credentialing on the early education workforce, requiring college degrees, for example, and then that may lead to a sort of the elimination of certain folks out of the early childhood workforce. I know, from participating in lots of iterations of the Power to the Profession framework, that's a topic, and the supports that would be necessary, and the timeline that would be necessary to support a transition like what the framework calls for was a big part of that conversation. I want to give you a chance to sort of weigh in on that concept.
Dan, you're right. The thing that undergirded our work throughout the process was that we're not asking for something that we're not also asking for the supports for anybody to be able to achieve it. That there are different paths based on what your choice is as a teacher for the level that you want to reach. And then that there's compensation to pay for that in an ongoing way. So if you just think of how we've done it in the past, which is a bit more hit and miss, I would say, then you would have reason to be concerned about that. But if you had been a part of how we conceived of this framework, and if you read it, it's practically on every page that we're not saying we're requiring harder credentials, and then you're back to where you've always been, which is whatever you can manage to get from whatever program. But that in order to have specific credentials required, there has to be a pathway to get there for every teacher, no matter what their situation is, like Calvin actually mentioned earlier, and then to compensate for that. So Lauren, you may want to add something more specific, but that's my general feeling about it.
I know we're already over time. So I'm happy to.
I know to add real quick, Lauren, we are
I'm sorry, I didn't
down
realize.
on time, but
no, it's good. I know folks already have other questions, and we're happy to follow up with all of these pieces about, I know there are amazing questions in the chat around sort of how we do this for next steps, how we support states and advocates. There's a lot of resources that are already out there from many of the partners on this call and beyond about everything from facilities and how states can use some of the funds there, how states can use some of the relief funds to be able to move these pieces forward on compensation to advance equity, thinking about the K-12 pieces together. There are all kinds of pieces that we didn't have a chance to get into, but many more will be coming. I'm sure Dan will help us get it all out to everybody.
absolutely. I feel like we could have this conversation for many hours more.
Indeed.
So I want to take a moment to thank here as we wind down our panel. What a great conversation. Dr. Calvin Moore, Chief Executive Officer of the Council for Professional Recognition, Lanit Dumas, who is the Executive Director of the National Association for Family Child Care, Lauren Hogan, Managing Director of Policy and Professional Advancement at the National Association for the Education of Young Children, and our friend Karen Ponder, Distinguished Fellow at the Build Initiative. It has been such a treat to talk with you all. I am looking forward to the day that the group of us are all going to be back in the room together again, and that we can continue this conversation. But thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this panel, and thanks to all of you for taking time out of your what we know is a very busy work day to participate in this conversation. One thing as we go, and I regret that I had a slide all ready to show you. It was going to be so pretty, and I forgot to open it. So in the interest of time, I will tell you that we will be back on Thursday, actually not Thursday, tomorrow. It's an unusual Wednesday webinar, but our Race and Education webinar series will be live tomorrow afternoon, talking about how students of color leave the STEM field at almost twice the rate of their white peers. And so we're going to have a race and education conversation around retaining racially diverse students in STEM programs in education. And I hope that that is something that you can join us for. All of the access information is available. If you visit the Hunt Institute's Twitter account, for example, you can access the registration links there, or any of our social media. It is great to be with you all today. I wish you a wonderful Tuesday afternoon and evening. And again, thank you for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.